Clara's really interesting because she works with the City Bridge Trust. And over the years, the last few years, they've been reassessing how they fund civic society groups. And COVID, I think, was the instrument in making them think that. How do they tackle the big problems that people are facing to ensure sustainability and to enable a responsive approach? And how do they do that by trying to get funding organized in a different way, and how funding can be decided upon by what is called a co-design process, which people are really beginning to work on now. And Clara has been doing that with others in what they call the anchor program, and she's now beginning to think about how they can do that around climate justice as well. And so it's interesting to talk to her about that and how her thought processes have gone on that. Well, I hope, Clara, I've sort of praised that as correctly as I can, and I'm sure if I've got it wrong, you would tell me. So can we start with you? And if you could tell me, you've been involved in developing these funding opportunities for civil society, like the Anchor Project, and in doing it in a new way. Tell us what the purpose was behind that.
Thanks, Francis. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Um, I'll give a bit of background as to what City Bridge Foundation does. We had a recent name change, Francis. Well, not well, in the last 2 years. We're now City Bridge Foundation and not City Bridge Trust. Um, so we are London's largest independent funder, and we've been around since 1995. Um, we are the funding arm of Bridge House Estates, and Bridge House Estates has been around for 900 years, and it owns the five bridges in the square mile. So Tower Bridge, London Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge, Southwark Bridge, and Millennium Bridge. Um, and so we are, as a foundation, we are primarily a bridge owner. And secondary to that is we are a funder. So back in 1995, it was decided that our surplus income would be used for charitable objectives. So that's where City Bridge Foundation was born. We're based at the City of London Corporation, and they are our sole trustee. Um, but to answer your question, Francis, the purpose behind the Anchor program was um, well, it primarily came about during the pandemic. We were thinking about we were witnessing new ways of funding. We recognized that there was increased access to core funding and flexible funding for organizations. And we saw that this new way of working was strengthening London civil society during quite a challenging time. Um, so we had the idea of creating a funding program like the Anchor program, but before we really started designing it, we held a roundtable session where we invited um, organizations in the sector, and we did some consultation work with them, and we asked them whether a program like the Anchor program um, would be well received in the sector. Um, and basically, the aim of the program it was to fund 7 to 10 years, so to award 7 to 10 years of core funding to infrastructure organisations in London. Infrastructure organisations are organisations that provide support to other organisations, and that could be through the form of capacity building support, organising networks, carrying out policy and research work, and other formats as well. Um, so we had the roundtable session, and from that, the Anchor program was born. We realised that it would be really well received by the sector, especially long-term core funding. And we recognise that infrastructure organisations a lot of them were shutting down during the pandemic. A lot of them weren't receiving a lot of funding. We knew that a program like this would be really well received. So the aim of the Anchor program was to really help infrastructure organizations focus on systems change work, and it was also to support organizations that demonstrate a commitment to intersectional and equitable practice. And we wanted to support infrastructure organizations whose work was led by and for, or at least co-designed by the communities that they support. And the real aim of the program was to fund organisations with a core focus on systems change in order to make London a fairer city. So the program was launched in 2023. And the funds were awarded in two rounds. Um, and in total, we awarded £26 million to 22 organisations across the 2 years, across both rounds of funding.
And
Um,
and that process you're talking about that you did through the Anchor program and through
yeah.
COVID, you are now thinking, aren't you, that you want to look at climate change, not just climate change, but climate justice.
Mm.
Why are you beginning to, in your mind and with your colleagues, think about climate justice? Why is that important to you?
So we've just recently gone through a strategy review at City Bridge Foundation, and we're looking at what our strategy is going to look like for the next 10 years. And we really want to position ourselves as a social justice funder. So that's really focusing on the root causes of inequality and injustice in London through systemic change, but also addressing immediate community needs. So in summary, we want to become a funder that is focusing on changing the systems that are keeping people marginalized. One of the focus areas will be climate justice. And the reason why this is such an important area to be funding is because we recognize that there are groups of people who are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. And we recognize that those who have contributed the least are the most impacted. And what the strategy aims to do through the climate justice funding program is to empower the communities that are hardest hit by climate change, as well as environmental hazards and pollution. And we want to support a fair and inclusive transition as London moves towards net zero goals. And we want to fund organisations that are focusing on organising and advocacy work that are being led by those most affected. And ensuring that they can help shape the transition and hold systems accountable as well. And so, why climate justice? I recently read a report that said, and I'm going to quote what the report said, it said, there is perhaps no global issue more interconnected, transversal, and ripe for a systems level approach than climate change. It is the biggest crisis facing Londoners, and it intersects also with racial justice. We know that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic populations are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. It also intersects with economic justice. We know that people living in poverty, um, people that are living in areas with the highest number of that are most impacted by poverty, they are more exposed to environmental impacts and they can't afford protections to mitigate the effects of climate change on their lives. Um, and they also may live in poorly insulated housing. We know that air pollution is the biggest public health issue. To summarize, there's so much evidence to show that this is an area we should definitely be focusing on as a
And
funder.
and you mentioned, climate justice is about working with those groups most affected, the most
Hmm.
vulnerable. And part of your process of funding is to ensure that there is co-design with those
Yeah,
groups, isn't it?
yeah.
Do you want to tell us how important it is? Because people use that term co-design,
Mm,
glibly very often, but it has a real content in it, doesn't it?
absolutely. Um, I think it's really important for funding programs to be co-designed. Um, and I think there should be the reason we were able to co-design during the Anchor program was because there was an openness to doing things differently at City Bridge Foundation, and we recognize that we're constantly asking organizations to evidence the way, why they're doing the work that they're doing, how can they evidence what the need is, yet we don't evidence what our current systems are working as a funder. And there was a real question around who gets to decide what a funding program should look like. So that's why um, we really wanted to ask a group of organizations to help us design the anchor program. And it would be great to take a similar approach for the climate justice program as well. Um, but also just to recognize that there are some challenges around doing co-design work. We experienced challenges around figuring out how we were going to compensate people for their time because it was such a new thing that we were doing at City Bridge Foundation. We didn't really have a process in place for that. Um, we also it was really important that we made sure that the sessions were inclusive and accessible. We were working with a number of leading deaf and disabled people's organisations that were staffed by wheelchair users and people who are visually impaired. So it's really important when we were holding in-person sessions and online that we were really prioritising accessibility. Um, Also, finding times and dates that work for everyone, being mindful of school holidays, religious holidays when you're doing co-design work is really important. But the number one thing I would say is how crucial it is to build trust with the organizations that you're working with. And also recognizing that there is such a thing as consultation fatigue and constantly asking organizations for their feedback. So how do you make sure that you're doing it in a really safe, inclusive, and accessible way? And that it's not extractive or tokenistic. That's really important. So I definitely think those values should kind of underpin how we do co-design through the
I mean,
justice area.
in your job, which is really an interesting job, you get a chance to. You're smiling.
Yeah.
You have a chance, don't you, to visit different organisations, and one of them you visited was the Lambeth Climate Partnership, and you
Yeah.
said you would put us in touch with them because they're doing some really interesting work, aren't they? I mean, what did you
Mm.
learn from them?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So they gave a presentation on a piece of research they carried out called Cooling Five Ways. And basically it was research to help most vulnerable residents combat summer heat in Lambeth. So the work captured residents' experience of the recent heat waves that we've experienced in London, and they tested key messages around health vulnerabilities. And they also trialed a simple, low-cost tool called Cool Kits that included cooling blankets and fans. Um, and that was to help keep residents safe and comfortable during the heat wave. Um, but the aim of the research was to inform effective mitigation and adaptation measures for the most vulnerable communities across Lambeth and London. There were lots of findings, and I'm happy to share the link in the chat because they've summarized the findings on their website. But just to highlight a few, they mentioned that public spaces are not designed for the extreme heat we've been experiencing, and there are a lack of adequate facilities and shelter, which exposes residents to high temperatures. They found that 70% of participants that were surveyed, their main concern during heat waves was staying cool when they're outside of their homes, and there's a real lack of access to green spaces for a lot of residents. Um, they highlighted that people need more shade and cool spaces. They need more access to public toilets, access to water fountains, um, and to summarize, the key finding was that urban areas need to be better designed. We need better designed public spaces with cooling infrastructure, water access, and social amenities to make sure that people are comfortable when experiencing extreme heat.